What if the most powerful economic recovery in human history had nothing to do with money? That question should stop you cold. Because if it is true, it means the entire story you have been told about how wealth gets built, about what you need before you can begin, about waiting for the right moment and the right resources, is a lie that somebody constructed very carefully and sold to you at a very high price. The proof is buried in the winter of 1946, hidden in plain sight in the story of a generation that had nothing. No credit, no savings, no safety net, nothing but a handful of invisible tools that most people alive today have completely forgotten how to use. And those tools rebuilt an entire civilization from the ash up. This is not an inspiration story. This is an investigation. We are going to open up that era like a case file and look at what is actually inside. What we find is going to make you uncomfortable about the choices you are making right now. Let us set the scene. Not with numbers, with a street corner. It is the winter of 1946. Pick any city. Detroit, Baltimore, Chicago. The war is over. The boys are home. And the air on that street corner smells like coal smoke and cheap coffee and something harder to name. Something that sits between desperation and hunger. Not the hunger of skipping lunch. The hunger of a man standing in front of his wife and his 2 young children, looking at a kitchen with nothing in it, knowing that the last $3 he had in the world went to the landlord yesterday morning before the sun came up. He is not a weak man. He is not a foolish man. He fought in a war. He watched people he loved die in places whose names he could barely pronounce. He came back carrying psychological damage that his generation had no language for yet, because the words trauma and PTSD would not exist in common usage for another 30 years. He came home, he stood on that street corner, and the world looked at him and said, simply, "Congratulations, now figure it out." There was no severance, no safety net, no universal basic income. There was a small check from the GI Bill if he was fast with the paperwork and lucky with the bureaucracy. There was a handshake, there was a thank you, and then there was silence. Just a man and an empty kitchen and a family watching him from across the room. Now here is the part that should make your stomach tighten. That broke, exhausted, traumatized man with no roadmap and no backup became the foundation of the most explosive economic expansion any country had ever produced. Within 15 years, his family owned a home. Within 20 years, his children were heading to college. Within 30 years, his neighborhood had a hardware store and a diner and a credit union and a little league field and a church that was fully paid for. How? How do you build all of that starting from a kitchen with nothing in it? The textbooks have an answer. They talk about government spending and the Marshall Plan and post-war industrial demand. All of that is real, but it is the surface. It is the visible paint on a wall. Underneath the paint, holding everything up, was something that cannot be measured in dollars. Something the financial industry has spent decades hoping you would never notice, because if you noticed it, you would not need half the products they are selling you. Character. Not as a decorative concept. Not as a word for eulogies and trophies. Character as a structural tool. The way a steel beam inside a wall is a structural tool. You cannot see it. But take it out, and everything falls. We have forgotten what that word actually means. We have polished it into something soft and inspirational. But in 1946, on that street corner, character was not inspirational. It was the difference between eating and not eating. It was the only engine running. To understand how that engine was built, we have to go back further, back to the decade that forged the people who would do the rebuilding, back to the 1930s. Because you cannot understand what 1946 constructed without understanding what the 1930s destroyed, the Great Depression. We hear that phrase, and we picture black and white photographs, bread lines that look almost peaceful in their stillness, men in hats with their hands in their pockets. It looks like a history exhibit. It does not look like a decade-long nightmare that left permanent marks on an entire generation. But that is exactly what it was. The photographs never show you the smell. 3 families sharing 2 rooms in an apartment building because none of them could afford their own place. They do not show you the sound a man makes when he sits at the kitchen table after his children are asleep and counts what he has left and realizes the number is still wrong. It is always wrong. They do not show you the silence of a marriage under financial pressure. Not fighting, not screaming. Just the particular silence of 2 people who love each other and cannot figure out how to stop what is happening to them. By the time the 1930s finished, an entire generation of Americans had graduated from a school that no university has ever replicated, the school of radical scarcity. And that school taught 3 lessons that cannot be learned any other way. The first lesson was this: objects are not security. A generation that watched everything material stripped away, the house, the car, the savings, the furniture, piece by piece across 10 years, came out the other side knowing in their bones that things cannot protect you. The neighbor who lost his house in 1931 had more stuff than the neighbor who kept his house. The stuff was not the point. The second lesson was this: your reputation is a currency, and it holds its value when paper money does not. In a world where banks had collapsed and institutions had proven they could vanish overnight, the only thing that reliably held its worth was what the people around you knew about you. Whether you paid back what you borrowed, whether you showed up when you said you would, whether your word was actually worth something. In neighborhoods across every city and small town in America, this reputation system was the operating system underneath the entire local economy. The butcher who let you run a tab was not doing charity. He was making a calculated bet based on your character history. He had watched your family for years. He knew your father. He knew whether you were the kind of person who honored a debt or the kind who disappeared when things got hard. That invisible credit score, written in the collective memory of the community, was more powerful than anything a bank could ever issue. The third lesson was the deepest. Time is the only real asset. When you have no money and no possessions, the only thing you truly own is your hours and the skills you can build inside them. The people who survived the 1930s intact, not just financially but as whole human beings, were the ones who used their empty time to build capability. They learned to fix things, to grow things, to make things from other things. They became, through pure necessity, extraordinarily capable people. A woman who learned to sew in 1933 did not pick up a needle because she wanted a hobby. She did it because a new dress cost money her family did not have, and her daughter needed something to wear to school. But 10 years later, that skill was an asset. 20 years later, it was a small business. The thing that poverty forced on her became the foundation of something she built. Not despite the scarcity, because of it. Now we arrive at the post-war world, the homecoming. Millions of men returning from places that had broken something in them, trying to reassemble their lives and their families, and into that moment, a villain arrived. Not a person, a system. A set of mechanisms that emerged in the 1950s and has been accelerating ever since. Built specifically to extract wealth from people who are just getting started. Built to replace the invisible tools of the 1946 generation with purchasable substitutes that do not actually work. The first mechanism is consumer credit. And we need to be careful here, because credit has legitimate uses. But in the hands of a marketing machine that spent decades studying human psychology, it became something else. It became a trap wearing the costume of a shortcut. Here's how the trap works. The generation of 1946 built things slowly. They saved. They waited. They delayed because they had no other option. The discipline was forced on them by circumstances, and it produced results that lasted. A house paid off in 15 years is a house that cannot be taken from you. A car bought with cash is a car that does not cost you money every month when you're not driving it. But in the 1950s, something shifted. The industrial machine that had built tanks and bombs during the war needed a new customer. It found one in the returning soldiers and their growing families. The pitch was elegant and devastating. You do not have to wait. You can have it now. The television, the washing machine, the car, the house in the suburb, all of it today for a small monthly payment. The monthly payment. That phrase should be tattooed on the inside of every eyelid as a warning. Because the monthly payment is the mechanism by which the system moves wealth from the people building it to the people who already have it. Every month you carry a balance. You are paying someone for permission to use money you technically have access to but do not own. You are renting financial capability. And the rent is set by people whose entire professional purpose is to keep it as high as you will tolerate without walking away. The second mechanism is the infrastructure of aspiration. The entire consumer economy of the post-war era was built on one idea, that who you are is defined by what you own. The right car signals something about you, the right neighborhood, the right watch, the right kitchen, all of it broadcasting your status to the world. This was engineered, not accidental. There were rooms full of very smart people in advertising agencies and psychology departments figuring out how to make you feel inadequate without what they were selling, how to create a hunger that could never be permanently satisfied, how to ensure that the moment you acquired the thing you wanted, the standard had already quietly shifted. The thing you now had was already slightly insufficient, slightly out of date, slightly less than what the truly successful people were carrying. The system needed you hungry. A satisfied customer stops buying. A permanently dissatisfied customer is the whole business model. So the system built an economy of permanent dissatisfaction and then sold you solutions to the dissatisfaction it created. The third mechanism is the subtlest and the most corrosive. It is a replacement of community capital with financial capital. Remember the butcher and his tab. Remember the reputation economy. The web of trust and mutual obligation that held communities together through the Depression and the war years. The post-war consumer economy did not destroy that web through malice exactly. It destroyed it through convenience. If you can pay cash, you do not need to know your neighbors. If you have a credit card, you do not need anyone to vouch for you. If you can buy everything you need from a store that does not know your name, the relationships that were once essential become optional. When they became optional, they became rare. And when they became rare, something happened that is impossible to fully measure but very easy to feel. The social fabric thinned. The informal network of mutual support that had absorbed financial shocks for generations began to fray. People became more isolated, more dependent on institutions, more fragile when things went wrong. A man who loses his job in 1935 is desperate, but his neighbor knows him. His community knows him. There is a web of informal support that catches him, slows his fall, buys him time to recover. A man who loses his job in 1985 is desperate in a different, lonelier way. He has a house in a suburb where he does not know 3 people on his street. He has credit card debt and a car payment and a mortgage. The institutions that were happy to work with him while he was employed will now move with cold mechanical efficiency to take everything he has built. So what is the exit? What does any of this mean for the person sitting in the present tense trying to build something? Let us be honest first. You cannot recreate 1946. The world has changed in real ways, and some of those changes are genuinely good. There is no romance in actual poverty. The 1930s were brutal, and the war years were devastating, and we should not dress them up. But what you can do is understand what the generation of 1946 actually used to build with. Not the historical conditions, the tools, and then find the modern version of those tools and pick them up. The first tool is the long game. That generation did not expect to be wealthy in 3 years. They expected to be slightly less poor next year than they were this year and the year after that. Small improvements, stacked. Every skill learned makes the next one easier. Every debt paid off frees up money to eliminate the next. Every relationship built creates the possibility of the next one. If you cannot see 10 years ahead and stay patient with the progress of the next 10 months, the system has already won. Because the system runs on impatience. Every product it sells you is a solution to the intolerable feeling of not yet being where you want to be. The moment you can sit with not yet, you become very hard to exploit. The second tool is deliberate reputation. It looks different now. It is not the butcher and his ledger, but the logic is identical. Be the person who does what they said they would, who shows up, whose word actually means something. In every professional and personal network, people who have been quietly building this kind of reputation for years get opportunities that never get posted publicly. They get called first. They get the benefit of the doubt. This is not networking in the hollow business card sense. This is the slow accumulation of trust capital. It cannot be faked. It cannot be rushed. But it compounds the same way money compounds, and it is far harder to take away. The third tool is the radical underestimation of what you actually need. The 1946 generation had very little and built on that foundation. Most people today have far more than that generation could have imagined, and they feel like they are starting from nothing because 50 years of aspirational marketing has inflated the baseline of what counts as nothing. You have a phone in your pocket containing more knowledge than any library that existed in 1946. You have access to global markets and free education and communication tools that would have seemed impossible to the man on that winter street corner. You are not starting from nothing. The system has simply convinced you that you are. The fourth tool is the hardest. Community, deliberately chosen and deliberately maintained, not the community that geography assigns you. The people you choose because they share your direction, your values, your standard. People who will tell you when you are wrong and mean it as an act of respect. People whose success you can celebrate without reservation because you understand that their rising does not require your falling. This is what the system cannot handle. Not the individual who decides to save instead of spend. not the family that pays off their mortgage early. Those are minor inconveniences. What a system genuinely has no answer for is a community of people who have collectively decided they do not need what it is selling, who trust each other enough to share resources, share information, share risk, and absorb each other's setbacks without catastrophic individual collapse. That is what 1946 actually was. Not a government program, not an economic miracle handed down from above. It was millions of people in their neighborhoods and their church basements and their kitchen tables making quiet, collective decisions to hold each other up and build something together using the only things they had: their time, their word, their skill, their willingness to show up for each other day after day for as long as it took. The man on that Winter Street corner in 1946 had nothing. No credit, no savings, no guarantee of anything. But he had a name that meant something on his block. He had a skill in his hands. He had a neighbor who would lend him a tool and expect it back Tuesday. He had a wife who knew how to make something from almost nothing. He had children watching him, which meant stopping was not an option. That was his net worth. It turned out to be enough. The question is whether you understand, at the deepest level, what he was actually working with. Whether you can see through 50 years of advertising that has tried to convince you that wealth begins with money. Whether you can find your way back to the tools that still work, that are still free, that are still exactly as powerful today as they were on that street corner in the coldest winter of the last century. The answer to that question is the only thing standing between where you are and where you are trying to go, and it has nothing to do with money.